welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a new Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. My name is Madison, and I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma. And today we're going to be talking about the beloved community. So bear with me while I read off a quick definition here. So we subscribe to Dr. Martin Luther King's definition of the beloved community as a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace and justice will prevail over war and military conflict. So that's just like a quick definition, pretty timely with MLK Day being on January the 18th. And so first, we're going to start off with a word association. We have everyone's names up on the screen. So before you do your 1 to 3 words, just do a quick introduction.
Yeah, anyone who wants to go first can go first.
I can get us started off. So I would say that I think of peace and harmony just because those are the things that come to mind. I think even peace was even in the definition of that. But I think that's like the ultimate kind of harmony that we're striving for and trying to build towards.
I can go next. I'm Jasmine, and I'm from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I'm a freshman at the University of Alabama. And the 2 words that I probably choose would be inclusivity and receptivity, because I feel like beloved community is rooted in hearing everybody's opinions and making sure that no one is restricted from the group, regardless of who you are and your character attributes, your race, gender, socioeconomic status, or anything like that. I feel like hearing other people's thoughts and ideas is very important in beloved community, as well as making sure that everyone feels included and is welcome with open arms.
David?
Yeah, I'll take a stab. I was waiting for you, Gary, but I'll go. I'm David Cooperstein. I'm on the Framers Council for Civics Unplugged. I'm here in Seattle, which is warm-ish but rainy. Well, the first word that came to me was idealistic, and maybe that's just because just looking at the world through what we're going through now versus what that description sounds like. So idealism, but also equality was a big theme that came out of that. Like it seems like it's trying to lay a level playing field. That everybody should benefit from the beloved community. So those are the 2 words that did it for me.
Happy to jump in. I'm Gary. I'm one of the co-founders of CU. I'm calling in from New York City. One of the words is global, because the beloved community vision of MLK's was a global one. I think he was prescient in thinking that, injustice anywhere signals that there's injustice everywhere, right? And that any really catastrophes today affect all of us. I'll actually leave it at that.
I'd be happy to go next. Hi, my name is Chabu. I am 19 and based in Toronto and a first year at the University of Toronto. When I think of the beloved community, the first word is necessary. I do agree with David in the sense that it seems like unachievable and a bit too ideal, but I do think it's necessary. I can't think of a single goal or ambition that we might have as a society that can't be enriched by taking place in a beloved community. And my second word is fortifying, which is in the same vein of that. You can get through really difficult things as a collective if, again, it all takes place in a beloved community.
I guess I'll go. Hello, my name is Aaron Piando. I was born and raised in McAllen, Texas. That's where I'm calling from today. And I'm currently a junior at Idea Quest College Preparatory. And when I think of the beloved community, the first two words that come to mind are love and appreciation, because I definitely think that's where everything starts with the beloved community. Just simply like acknowledging the fact that your neighbor exists and appreciating their existence and wanting the best for them. I feel like you can go into a lot of planning and theorizing about creating like this ideal community, but I think it all has to start with having love and appreciation for your neighbors.
I'll put, Zoe, you want to jump in?
Yes, sorry for hopping on late, but hi everyone, my name is Zoe. I am a senior in Lexington, Kentucky. And the two words that come to mind, love for sure, I see that's already been written down, but also restorative. I think that part of being in a beloved community is that you can really help people, I think, fulfill everything that they're supposed to fulfill, but also help them, I guess, overcome other things that have faced them in the past.
Okay, thank you all for sharing those words. And now we can get into the actual discussion. So if anyone wants to pose a question or a provocation, we can get started.
What do you think is standing in the way of the building of this beloved community?
I'd be happy to start with this question. I do think that there are tons of things, like our society and cultures aren't really conducive to having a beloved community. Like individualism is so popular, but among all that, it's also the fact that there aren't a lot of examples of beloved communities. There are a lot of examples of bad ones, and so it's really hard to replicate something that you haven't witnessed before.
Also, does the definition vary depending on who perceives what a beloved community is? I mean, I'm not sure it's completely different, but I think there might be different interpretations of what that phrase is. So it might mean very different things to different people.
Yeah, Madison, did you, sorry, I'm blanking. Did you say the definition or no?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. So the one that I think, I mean, I'm sure many people have different definitions, but let's talk more about the kind of global, almost a utopic vision that MLK spelled out of like no war, like no poverty type thing.
I think that our word association is pretty telling of some foundational things that are standing in the way. So like I see love brought up twice, appreciation, inclusivity, just those foundational things that cannot, the beloved community cannot exist without them.
Yeah, I guess I would like what you said, Madison. I think love is pretty lacking right now. I think that our society has started defining love, I think, in a way that really boxes it in of like, you love your romantic partner and you love your family. But love means a lot more than that. And you can love a lot of people even without knowing them. So I think that like limiting that definition has really hurt people and how they can like see what love really is.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on my question about or my point about different things to different people. Um, uh, how, I guess what I'm trying to express there is what's standing in the way is whether people all want this or not, or whether, utopian ideas tend to be led by people who have that utopian idealist, which is why that was one of my words, view of the world. But I'm not sure everybody thinks that that's utopia. So that's why I was asking, like, what's standing in the way is I don't think there's, in order to have utopia, you have to have universal agreement that that's what everybody wants. And so I think what's standing in the way might be that not everybody wants the same thing. They might want something different. Like they don't want everybody to live in peace and harmony. They might want something that's more challenging. And if you don't have universal buy-in to it, it's very hard to get it to be achieved. So that was sort of what I was saying about what it means for different people.
Makes sense. On that note, one thing getting in the way of building any vision, really, especially a big vision, is even talking about long-term visions. I think it's really uncommon to talk about long-term visions, 10, 20-year visions, 30-year visions.
I think that another barricade between humanity and achieving a sort of beloved community would be a lot of people feel like it's impossible to do it. So they're not even motivated to even try and push towards becoming a part of or starting a beloved community.
And I would say on David's point about like not everyone wanting the same thing, like I think equity plays a big role in that, and also what Chabu was saying about like individualism, that if you have grown up in a certain world and with a certain worldview where things seem perfect, you don't want to lose that, which I don't think a beloved community means that you would lose any of the good things that you do have. But I think humans are resistant to change, and change does mean uncertainty and could mean that things look differently.
Yeah, scarcity.
So it's important. Yeah.
This makes me think of another question based on what David talked about and what Jasmine did as well, like the whole idea of a utopia. I think it's pretty obvious that we're never going to reach a utopia, but I think it's really interesting to think about why is it important to strive for a sort of utopia like the beloved community when you're trying to build the future? Or is it, I guess, would be a question.
So can I give an example? Is that appropriate? Because last year, right around this time, I was in Rwanda, and Rwanda is a really interesting country because they had to go so far down to the depths of pure living hell, if you know the story of Rwanda, and then put in what is essentially a benevolent dictator who has made society an incredibly uniform place, and incredibly uniform, not in a like everybody does the same thing, but everybody has housing. There's everybody's taken care of. The place is spotless as an entire country. There's actually one Sunday, I think it's a Sunday a month, everybody does nothing but clean around their community. Everybody, 100% of the population has to do this. And I don't know if that's that was done to, it was a reaction to something. And it was also because the person who came in as a result of that reaction has full control of the country. It's the opposite of most dictators that you think of. Most dictators are not benevolent. He's very benevolent. But I'm just curious how that, did you have to sink so low that you rise up to seek utopia? Is the question that I'm trying to get to.
Wow, great question.
It was an amazing experience to go there, I've got to say.
I think a really interesting point is the fact that, like, in order to come to a point where, like, that nation was able to, like, really rally and commit to investing in their community, there had to be, like, a really extremely bad negative experience. And I don't even know if this is, like, an answer to the question of, like, striving for utopia. But I think that if we're not, like, in a constant, I wish that there was a way to be in, like, a constant state of, like, wanting to do better without necessarily having to have, like, a really negative, extreme experience to like kind of bring that reaction out of people. Because in the few experiences where I've like seen something similar, there's always just something like horrible that preludes that sense of community that's established. Like I think about the US and 9/11, there was so much like patriotism that took place and like so much gathering of people and like investment in the community. But I don't think we needed to have such like an insanely negative event to prelude that. So I think striving is necessary because we can't only do it as like a reaction to bad events.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, clearly we're going through that at the moment with a different crisis. Somebody's got to mention that at this point. I mean, to get to a utopia, you have to believe that you have to believe 100% that 100% of the people around you are deserving of the same utopia that is laid out in the vision. And in order to get to that point, I think you do need to shake people up because you need to show that the foundation that they thought was true is no longer true and that you're all trying to build towards something. I don't like that that's the case. But it's a utopian thought to think that everybody wants to strive for something better for people around them.
Wow.
Only, in addition to themselves.
Wow.
Okay, so I know that we like read off that definition, but I'm almost wondering what else besides what was read off in the definition do you think should be included in the beloved community?
Maybe the beloved community point is that it should be the striving. So rather than it being an end state, which is the way that MLK defined it, if I recall you saying that, instead of saying what the endpoint is, maybe it's to define what an endpoint would look like, but that the real utopia is that everybody's working together to get there. Based on some of the points that have been made, like what Chabu said. That maybe utopia is actually people all wanting the same thing and moving towards the same thing as opposed to actually arriving there.
And I think that raises, I guess, another kind of, it's not an added question, but I guess it's a question to validate what David said was that, is that achievable? Like, will you know when you're done? Because I feel like any progress you make, there should always be something else that you are going to be fixing because other problems are going to arise. So yeah, I like the idea of the beloved community being a pursuit and like a joint process versus when we have these 10 things, the world will be perfect, because we know that's not the case.
Well put. Chabu, do you have anything to add to that? Process related?
I mean, just like reacting to what Zoe said, I feel like the definition also needs to like the process of achieving it needs to be inclusive of the fact that like there are people who may not resonate with it. There's not always going to be like a culture where people are excited or invested or understand the necessity. It almost needs to like include the fact that this is bound to fluctuate.
Yeah, it feels like the beloved community building process needs to be highly evolutionary. And if there's one thing that everyone agrees to, it's that it's evolutionary and participatory, and that evolution is a participatory process itself. I think it's interesting. I think that if there's like a coalition of people that are like actually trying to create an inclusive, beloved community building process, it's sort of a forcing function to see like who is not interested in this. Also, and then also on the other end, it's like, I hope that this is the case. Like one of my favorite phrases is race to the top. I don't see that many of them happening, right? But we often talk about race to the bottom, right? Like getting like worse. Like they talk about like iPhones getting like going from like China to like Myanmar, right? To like cheaper and cheaper places because labor keeps getting more expensive in the country that they're already at. It's like a race to the bottom. But like, how do you spark races to the top, right? Like, how do you get like powerful entities to like race to start being in this participatory process?
Yeah, like one thing I've learned over time is that if the goal is too far away, it's hard to get people there. So breaking it down into, so this is part of striving for utopia, is if you could break down the problem and sort of work your way up, like, poverty has been eliminated in a lot of the world until this year. There's a lot of until this year in this. But poverty, the reduction in poverty is going the right direction. The reduction in hunger is going the right direction. If people saw those milestones as part of, maybe to Gary's point, there's 10 things that we're trying to strive for, and we want to race each one of them to the top rather than trying to make the utopia be the end goal. It would be easier for people to break that down and say, because it's harder to refute, yes, I want people to be less hungry, yes, I want people to live with less poverty. And then you can sort of get the world to see why those things are good, and then get people to do the things that need to be done to get there, versus defining it very broadly and then having people say, well, I don't know what to do next. So breaking it down would be, I think would be helpful.
And I guess
that's 30 years of business talking.
Really, it's great.
Yeah, I'll say two things. I mean, I think Chabu mentioned this earlier, but not having any examples. Like, we don't know of a world that has no poverty. Like, none of us can even fathom exactly what that means, like for much of the world's population, or how you even get there. And so I think that alongside that, I mean, we publish a lot of really negative statistics of like, look at how many millions of people don't have this or don't have, that. And while that is a problem in itself, we often don't look at the progress we've made. Like, I would say that it wasn't until last year when I actually had to Google like where the world was with poverty. I was like, wow, we've actually like come a decent way with, reducing poverty, but that's not what you're seeing in the news. That's not what people are telling you. And that pessimism can be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're like, we're just never going to be able to fix that. And then you give up. And then, of course, it will never get fixed because you believe it won't be fixed either. So I think that like a growth mindset, I think, is really important when working towards that evolution.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to bring up about like the things being discouraging. It also reminds me of what Gary said about making long-term visions. I think that those are important, but you have to be careful with that as well, because I think if you're not, you can think too far in the future and be like, oh, there's going to be so many new problems anyway, like what's the point, and spending so much time trying to build this when like we're never going to achieve that. So I think there's like an interesting dance between that as well, and also between like thinking about like trying to be like, yeah, we are doing things to eradicate poverty, but we're not like nowhere near where we could be. And so it's like a dance between both of those and like long-term vision and actually thinking about it in ways that will optimize your ability to contribute and build towards that utopia.
This is something we talk a lot about here, but I just think that like the process of getting there should be fulfilling and like energizing and invigorating. Otherwise, like it's pointless in and of itself. And then you have like a widespread sense of just like it being really difficult or feeling unattainable, like getting there. should feel like an accomplishment in and of itself, and like how we go about that and how people engage with it. I feel like that should be fulfilling of the goal and of the people who are participating.
Joyful participation has to be fun to be active. By the way, Chabu, so David, we're sort of like kind of cooking up like a school of thought that we kind of subverted into saying it's a school of process, because there's a lot of thinking, but not a lot of doing. So we're creating the unplugged school of process. And what I'm realizing through this conversation is like, what are the processes that school of process like funnels up, right? And I think they all, at the end of the day, should probably be oriented around supporting building the beloved community. And there's like, and the macro processes depend on the most micro processes, like on the individual level. So to Chabu's point, right, like what is personal development? What do personal development processes have to do with kind of the most macro societal change? Everything, really.
Does anyone have something to add or want to pose a question or provocation?
I also want to add that another thing I feel like should be a part of the beloved community would be persistence and resilience, because being a part of a community regardless, I feel like one of the key purposes is to uplift others and empower other people to keep that community bond so strong and to make sure that everybody is still motivated. So even when hardships come up in the beloved community, you have that persistence and you have that resilience, being a pillar of the community that you know that you have to strive for it.
On the note, I feel like we have really gotten, we've really prioritized comfort in our society. And I think I think having a different relationship with pain, which doesn't have to be suffering, so that we are more resilient to the inevitable shocks that we face as individuals and on a wider scale. It's really essential. It's a great point, Jasmine.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Gary, I think a lot of the spirit of the individual is pervasive, at least in our society, probably in Western society. And I think that's where this becomes, that's why my initial point was, is it, you know, who's defining it? Because the spirit of individuality has definitely grown over the last, say, 40 or 50 years since this was defined. And you see this probably more in Asia than you do here in the States, where people are willing to go through a little bit of pain in order to support the greater good, or that they're more, just the nature of a community in the first place is a stronger motivating force than the what's in it for me if I participate in this community, which is a more Western view.
Yeah, this is kind of like making me think of another question that I want to pose. I think that, like, you know, when you're working toward, you can either like be working towards the beloved community or you can be like working away from it. So my question would be, I'm going to leave this as broad as possible. What entities do you think are working towards building the beloved community? It can be like as small as like yourself. You think maybe your school, a certain like, I don't know, organization. I would like to hear that.
I love how broad this question is, Madison. But I do think that like some of the entities that work towards the beloved community also work against it. It really just depends on like who's participating. So an example that I could think of is like social media. It's prevalent for like, you know, like not being a beloved community. But in that same breath, you can't ignore the fact that like it is a tool that has widened the scope of like our potential to have beloved communities. that go beyond like physical spaces and like where you live or who you know, or even just getting to like witness other beloved communities that you're not a part of and like having a genuine understanding of them from like a firsthand perspective. I think that's really cool. So but it can work towards or against. It really just depends on like how you interpret it, how you engage with it, and like how the world uses it either as an asset or a weapon.
So it seems like some of you are using the word beloved community as like something that there's like a bunch that could be in the world. And that's interesting, and that's maybe useful to even think about. Like, is the macro beloved community, would it ultimately be composed of, would it be nested communities that are all kind of collaborating with each other? And like, could you like individually maybe embody the macro beloved community? And is that even, maybe is that essential?
I think it is. I know that like we've mentioned before, like it's hard to strive for something when you don't have an example of it. So I think that's really important for like all of us at CU to be like living embodiments of the beloved community, and eventually like for us as an organization to like really feel like we embody that and show people like an example. And I think that that's what's key to building towards it. But I didn't have that realization until you mentioned that either.
And I think a neat example of like nesting, like I guess communities that are working towards the beloved community are like our Civics 2030 Juntos that are within the larger CU community, that you have a group of 8 people that you're like getting way closer to than maybe you could with like a larger group, but you're all still working towards a larger mission, even though you're in your own groups. And I guess in terms of like other entities, weirdly, the first thought that came to mind was like summer camp. I think a lot of kids have very fond memories of like summer camp where you kind of have like a very niche group of people. You're all there for something in particular. That's why you came to the summer camp in the first place. But I think there are a lot of values and virtues that are embodied in that kind of environment that you don't get like in a school or in many places that you'll work in your life. So yeah.
Ron, do you have any thoughts?
My mind's been kind of buffering for a bit here, but like my first reaction to Madison's question, I like immediately started thinking of a bunch of youth organizations, because I think in general, like all the youth organizations that I've personally seen or that I've like heard of, in general are trying to like turn the tide on what's currently happening. So like, I think of JSA and how they're trying to fight like political apathy. I think of Civics Unplugged and, you know, trying to promote civic education among the youth. I think nowadays, in general, I'm going to say youth organizations have definitely been focused on missions that are working toward beloved, like forming a beloved community. And maybe they're not as large right now, but I can definitely say that like they're growing, and they're also growing popularity. Like there's definitely more popping up, it seems, every day. So that's my answer for this one.
It's a good one.
Okay, I have another question based on what Gary said earlier about like, I guess like micro beloved communities. And so I think that something that we talk a lot about here is like personal development and starting with yourself. So my question would be is like, what can you do to build towards / embody the beloved community?
Great question.
I will nest this question underneath yours, Madison, but I mean, can you yourself be a beloved community? Like, can you share community with your own self? And is that necessary before you start, I guess, sharing that community with other people?
It's great. David, we talk a lot about like how there's like sub personalities inside like just different, like at least different impulses, like when you're like making decisions, and getting those in harmony, right? Making sense of them, being like just recognizing them, that they're valid, right? And it's interesting because like I guess something that we've realized is that learning to be empathetic with other people hinges so much on learning to be empathetic with yourself, or the different selves that you have.
Yeah, I was going to say that based on what you just said, but also what Zoe was talking about, can you be a beloved community? I think you need to, you probably can be, but it's insular. I think you have to understand what your role would be in creating that community. So for example, just thinking about the Civics Unplugged leadership, like each one of them, Nick, and from my experience, at least Nick, Josh, and Gary have very different personalities, but they know how to work together. And that's what creates their little nested community of, beloved community, because I'm sure that's how they could describe themselves. But we were also talking about family, and even within your family, if you pursue family relations in a way that is more empathetic, you're more likely to get your family to operate as a small beloved community. But there's certainly ways in which families don't do that. So I think the way I was thinking about what you were saying, Zoe, is that if you think about yourself and then how you participate in your local community or your direct environment, and then how that environment connects to the next broader environment, so it could be, me, high school or college, my friends, then the school, then the community, then, the country, or just think about what you see as your stack, to use a very technical term. That's a way to think about how you can have impact and where your role might change too. You might be one role in a smaller community and a different role in a bigger community.
I love the question that you posed, Zoe, in the sense that like the word community is also just like a larger subset of the word relationship. And so like, can you have a relationship with yourself? Absolutely. And if anything, that's like absolutely necessary. And I think it's important towards building a beloved community for two reasons. One being, as your like how your relationship with yourself and like your dynamic with like dealing with things that happen, both good and bad, informs how you engage with like the people around you. Like if I'm like having a bad day or like have some unresolved issue and it's like very personal to me, I might have a tendency to like snap at the person that's around me, or like snap at my brother later today. You know what I mean? That's just an example. But so yeah, I think that like you need to have a good relationship with yourself so that you can be a part of the community in a way that's like conducive to it feeling beloved. And then second to that, I also think that like, because I think a lot about just having a good relationship with yourself, and it definitely takes time. And it requires like ongoing investment and like learning and relearning things about yourself. And so those are skills that also transfer to engaging with the wider community, because if I know that this is something that I struggle with and I'm just like dealing with myself, like the most simple person you can deal with, I'm more empathetic with like coming across those struggles in dynamics with other people, because if it's complicated with one person, it's definitely complicated with two or three or four. So I think that there's like a lot of duality in like having a good relationship with yourself, and how that impacts having a good relationship in a beloved community.
Well put. Jazz, what do you think?
The first thing that came to mind when you posed this question was ambition. For some reason, I feel like ambition is very important in wanting to be a part of a beloved community and building yourself to become a part of that beloved community. You have to want it bad enough to build it, if you understand what I'm saying. You have to actually, in order to strive for it, in order to even have the idea of the possibility of a beloved community, you have to be ambitious. And then going back to what Chabu was saying, I feel like it's very important to tap into your own personality and to tap into self-compassion, and making sure that you're showing compassion to yourself, you're understanding yourself and knowing yourself to see what role you can play in a beloved community and how you take part in the leadership of it.
Well said. I mean, I think that there's sometimes a misunderstanding that like work related to love doesn't take a ton of audacity. Like it's kind of scary to say that you want to basically build, change the world, right? But you're not going to take meaningful steps until you admit that, to at least to yourself, and then you have to admit it to others that you build with.
All right, if there's no more thoughts for this question, we can go ahead and start the reflection. So I'm going to send a link to these notes in the Zoom chat so that you all can look over them. And then we'll go through and each talk about like reflection and, reflecting on this trek and charting next steps, which means like reflection and application. I can go ahead and get started. I think my big realization during this conversation was the idea that Gary brought up again of like the macro and then like the macro beloved community that is built by the micro beloved communities basically within your life, like even starting with yourself. And I think that's really like, I'm really relating it back to the idea of like civic season and our whole like concept with that of like just really like redefining what it means to civically engage. Because if we're building towards the beloved community, like civic engagement can look like so different if you make that the end point. It can even be like, building yourself, as David mentioned, trying to like make your family like a small beloved community. So I think that that's a really cool connection as well.
Yeah, on that note, like sometimes we just got to be honest, like our relatives, like our immediate families and relatives, the system that is that, the community that is that, it's often really dysfunctional or discordant. So I think just like living life is practice for trying to build something bigger. And I think it doesn't get enough credit for being that training ground.
Something that I kind of learned throughout this conversation was earlier at the start of the conversation, I mentioned how like we don't really have enough good examples of the beloved community. And I think I take that back, especially after having like going through the different entities that participate in creating that. I think we don't have like perfect examples of the beloved community, and we also shouldn't seek out perfect examples because it makes the process like almost unattainable if you're like looking for perfection. And so as like, again, thinking about the fact that this could be like such an overwhelming goal to try to achieve, as like David mentioned, I think that it's good to just like appreciate the qualities, like the specific practices or like minor examples that you might witness in different communities, and then like embody those rather than trying to replicate like a singular vision of what the beloved community could look like or what it means to be a part of that.
I know one thing that really stuck out to me was a lot of what David was saying towards the beginning, that people have to want it. And that, I mean, what people want can be very different depending on, I guess just what they've lived. And that like empathy and equity are just so important. And how do you like instill that in other people? And I guess get people to take risks when it really might benefit them to not do so. So figuring out how do you sell people on like trekking forward towards a beloved community.
Something I'm going to take away from this conversation is definitely a point that was made earlier about like how we define the beloved community in the first place, or how we define utopia as like, instead of defining it as like an end goal that like we would ultimately achieve, more as like a process. Because if we tell people about something that we want to achieve, it'll be harder to like actually visualize how to get there, as compared to when we like tell people what they have to be actively doing every day to ensure that we're working toward the ultimate goal. I feel like that's certainly more realistic in terms of building toward that beloved community, and definitely something worth thinking about more deeply.
Yeah, Aaron, that's a really great point. And what that made me think of is that if we are to say that the beloved community is more of a process than an endpoint, then we have to make the process look fun, right? Enjoyable. But it's not, and also make the on-ramp to be part of the process a lot less scary, right? It's like, you don't have to be like a full-time activist. Like, and that's, again, another part of civic season, which we can have a whole trek on that. But David, the idea is that, like, imagine that there was like 2 weeks before July 4th, where people just spent a lot of time thinking about their commitment, their civic contribution over the past year, and thinking about how they want to contribute over the next year. From July 4th to July 4th, how do you want to contribute to your to the beloved community, really?
Yeah, I mean, my big takeaway from this is that, well, for one thing, I'm probably less idealistic than all of you are. There's a dose of reality that needs that. So I've been, putting some dose of reality in here, but it's important for me to realize that the only way you get to something idealistic is to suspend your belief in the sort of the day-to-day, and that people are working towards this, and that there's sort of value in being realistic and there's value in being idealistic that need to be matched together in order to make some of the things that were said during this part. Both Gary and Aaron said this, but to get to the point where you're moving forward, you need a healthy combination of those two sides, the idealism and the realism.
I realized that a lot of what's involved with beloved community revolves around individuality and looking into yourself first before you expand outward to build a beloved community. So I feel like self-knowledge and knowing your demeanor, knowing your characteristics, your idiosyncrasy is very important to beloved community as a whole. And I feel like it's kind of that first key step.
I think that a cool observation that I kind of witnessed like while we're doing this reflection is the fact that like there's definitely like a bit of a difference in terms of like how we view the beloved community, and how like sometimes it feels like idealistic, and like for me it doesn't feel idealistic, it feels like ambitious, but ambition is kind of correlated with the idea of that like it's still a doable task. But I think that the differences are important too, because like here we are not necessarily completely agreeing on something, but this still feels like a beloved community. And like that's a cool example of how, again, the pursuit of perfection isn't the point here, but just like it can still happen while reconciling with the realities of like how people act and different dynamics.
Actually, I really like what you said about ambitious versus idealistic. I think that's a great way to sort of capture the difference that I was thinking.
Okay, so for everyone joining the trek for the first time, what were your thoughts on the format and just like the overall conversation?
I really like the format of it because I feel like, it's like a natural conversation. It's not too structured. It's just like us talking and sharing our ideas with one another. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great because it first of all, not diving into this, last minute, you learn a lot about how people think and also how you think over the course of the conversation. So you understand more about how your own biases come into play. So I've been like catching myself before I say things and thinking very cleanly about what I'm going to say before I say it, instead of just blurting stuff out, which helps to make a better conversation.
And I completely agree with what Jasmine said. Like, this felt like a completely like genuine, organic conversation. And I definitely enjoyed like taking on like kind of a listening role for like most of the parts. Like, I also enjoyed sharing my ideas, but I definitely think that you guys gave me a lot of food for thought as well. And I definitely did enjoy listening to everybody.
And Zoe, as someone who's seen kind of the evolution over the past, I guess, 20 installments, what are your thoughts on how this has evolved?
I think it's only gotten more organic over time. I have learned that I need to be very conscious about jumping in, because I think when we first started going and I got comfortable, I just wanted to talk all the time because I was like, I don't have a lot of spaces where I can just talk about this stuff, but I also have a tendency to talk way too much. It's been a good exercise in listening. I think it's really cool how we can have people come for the first time, and we now have a format where people really can like get into the deeper stuff pretty quickly. And I've enjoyed how everyone has been super open to experimenting with new things, like doing the word association at the beginning, doing the reflection at the end, like this, are all things that we've just iterated on. I'm excited to see what other new experiments come as we keep doing this.
Well said. Any final thoughts before we wrap?
Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming, and I hope to see you at a future trek. Have a great rest of your night.
Bye, everyone.